The absolute train wreck results for the Liberals in last Saturday's election in Western Australia. Boy, that's starting a bit of a panic in other states as well. Nervousness in Canberra too. In Western Australia, Labor leader Mark McGowan is now Premier of almost a one-party state, winning 52 of the 59 seats in the lower house. The Liberals will probably end up with just 3, the Nationals 4. And now Victoria, another Liberal leader could be out in his ear. Michael O'Brien faces a leadership challenge tomorrow morning from the little-known frontbencher Brad Batten, although there may be other candidates turn up, such as Tim Smith or former Liberal leader Matthew Guy. Some people are even hoping that my colleague Peter Credlin will be drafted in from outside, just like Campbell Newman was in Queensland. But here's the thing, the changing leaders actually help right now. It's true that O'Brien just does not have the cut-through. He was going to get smashed, provided, of course, Premier Daniel Andrews recovers from a serious back injury. But what opposition leader can win now against premiers that have been tough in the virus crisis? You see, in New South Wales, a poll commissioned by the Australian Workers' Union says the Labor opposition there is also headed for a wipeout under leader Jody Mackay, who called the unions cowards for leaking this. Meanwhile, though, the Morrison government, this is odd, is the one government going backwards in this coronavirus panic. For the first time since the election, Scott Morrison's government is behind Labor 48% to 52%. Joining me is the political panel, Michael Kroger, former Victorian Liberal President, and Michael Costa, former New South Wales Labor Treasurer. Michael Kroger, the WA Liberals absolutely smashed 2 days later a leadership challenge to Victoria's Liberal leader. Is that a coincidence?
Probably not, but you know, the times don't suit opposition leaders at the minute during the pandemic, unless, Andrew, and this is why they can win, unless you fathom a narrative outside COVID. So if you look at the federal polling, the downturn in the government's vote is because of the events in the last few weeks. It's not running its economic agenda. So if a state opposition can have a narrative which isn't related to COVID, it can win an election. As long as the narrative and the political debate within a state is about how the state governments and territory governments have responded to COVID, which the public thinks they've done well, they're going to win. So it's a reflection on oppositions. If they haven't built that alternative narrative, they're facing defeat, as we saw in Western Australia and as we're seeing the polls in New South Wales, Andrew.
Yeah, look, but we have to, I think, Michael, you've got to be, you've got to, I think, acknowledge that Michael O'Brien has struggled for cut-through. If there's a leadership spill tomorrow, who will emerge as leader, do you tip?
Well, I don't know, and I'm on the executive of the party down here, so I'll leave those matters to the opposition members of the parliamentary party. But every opposition leader has struggled in over the last 12 months, and as I said before, it's because the public are willing the premiers and the Prime Minister, mainly the premiers because they've been in charge of the borders, willing them to succeed. There's no point any voter hoping their state government fails. They're all willing the governments to succeed, and they largely have succeeded despite the disaster from Andrews here in Victoria. They're willing them to succeed, and that's why they're doing well in the polls, Andrew.
Michael Costa, does that analysis apply to New South Wales, your state? Because this poll, and you know, I always distrust internally commissioned polls that are then leaked, you know, commissioned probably with an agenda in mind. But that said, it says Labor would do even worse than Christina Keneally did, and that's saying something if an election were held now in New South Wales. Well, what do you make of all this? Why would this poll have been leaked?
Well, the first thing to say is I agree with the proposition that it's very difficult for oppositions in the current environment. You know, there has been a circling of the wagons, and people are supporting authorities, be they the medical authorities and the political masters that are supporting those medical authorities. So it is difficult. The New South Wales poll that was commissioned, I think you're right to be sceptical of it. There is a schism in New South Wales. It really does go back to, you know, the days of Yemma and myself, you know, there's been an inability. I think Maurice Yemma was right in relation to New South Wales. They haven't reflected on policy. They're basically, you know, being out-lefted by the Liberal government on a range of issues here. I mean, you know, Matt Keane here is more left-wing than even the left of the Labor Party. So they really haven't been able to carve out a policy platform that makes sense. There's been corruption issues in New South Wales. They haven't been able to cut through on those because they've got their own internal problems. But COVID, I think, is the key explanation here. You're not going to cut through whilst this pandemic is still there, and the government has the ability to use draconian political, medical measures, to carve out the agenda.
Well, I think there should be a warning to all voters that when the COVID crisis so suits premiers and leaders in power, just be careful about what they may be doing to exploit that and scaring you stupid. Now, then again, Michael Kroger, if you both are right, and oppositions do badly in a coronavirus crisis, when we're all looking, as one of you put it, we're willing leaders to succeed, why is the Morrison government now behind Labor in news poll, 48% to 52%?
So the reason, Andrew, is that the national conversation since the last news poll is not so much about COVID. It's now a secondary issue behind all of the other issues that we know are on the front page of the Fairfax Press and in the ABC. So the narrative has changed, and Albanese didn't create it, but he's surfing along with it. And secondly, the state premiers, the voters are rewarding great strength, even though that strength may have been overdone. They're rewarding great strength. So, Palaszczuk and Western Australia, the vote in New South Wales, which you talked about, Daniel Andrews' popularity here, still very strong in every state, and of course we know the territory results. Because they were seen to be the really strong figures, they're getting the credit. The Morrison government, because they weren't involved in strong action on border closures, are seen by the electorate as more of a passenger at National Cabinet rather than a leader of the National Cabinet. And that's why their polls aren't as strong as McGowan, Andrews, etc.
Michael
Andrew,
Costa?
Look, Andrew, firstly, I wouldn't put too much on this one poll because there's been all that noise around those issues you mentioned. However, I just want to point to this issue with the COVID vaccine rollout. I think and I raised this a few months back about concerns about the pace of the rollout, and there have been concerns raised about the national rollout and whether it's on time. You've got to remember that's feeding into this COVID environment, and you've got state leaders that are looking strong for whatever reason, and the national government, stumbled a bit on the rollout in the lead up to this news poll. So I think the two things are mutually explanatory.